Page 146 and 147 in your textbook. So here we're talking about pharaohs. Welcome to Pharaoh Week. And we're going to really kind of scan over some things on here, and really on the next page is where we're really going to do our reading. So here on page 146, what we need to know is the Nile was similar to how they grew on the Tigris and the Euphrates, how they grew crops. They were able to control the floods and be very successful farming. And because of that, they had a surplus. That was a vocab word last time. Surplus means extra food, right? So because they had all this extra food, they weren't required to really spend a lot of time doing a lot of extra farming because they had extra. They could kind of sit back and relax a little bit. And that led to their birth of the cities, okay? That meant that they had time, they had extra money, they had rich clothing, jewelry, luxury goods. And the people who brought all these in were merchants, which was traders, and artisans. Artisans is a vocab word, it's highlighted in yellow. Artisans or skilled workers who practice a handicraft. A handicraft would be something like painting or weaving or pottery of the like. Okay, and so because we had all of this surplus, people had extra time to focus on specific tasks, specific jobs, and we had the birth of artisans, which allowed people to have luxury goods. And therefore, these cities continued to grow and grow. Come on over here to page 147. I want to read this first section. The kingdoms of Egypt. During the 3000s BC, two kingdoms developed in Egypt. The king of Upper Egypt wore white crowns, and the kings of Lower Egypt wore red crowns. Remember, Upper Egypt is where the mountains are, right? Those are my mountains. And Lower Egypt is right where the Nile meets the Mediterranean, right? So Upper Egypt is south, and Lower Egypt is north. Kings of Upper Egypt wore white crowns. Kings of Lower Egypt wore red crowns. Uniting Egypt. Legends say that Narmer united the two kingdoms in about 3000 BC. This made him the first pharaoh, or king of a united Egypt. Pharaoh means king. He wore a double crown of red and white and founded Egypt's earliest dynasty. A dynasty is a ruling family. So he wore a red and a white crown because of the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Normally control passed between members of a dynasty. Sometimes, however, a new dynasty gained power. Historians divided Egypt's history into periods based on kingdoms and dynasties. The rest of this chapter talks about, again, how it breaks into, if we look at the whole history of Egypt, into different sections to talk about them. Okay, we had old, middle, and new kingdoms. What's really important here, though, is the Egyptian government. The pharaoh relied on what we call bureaucracy, vocab word here, bureaucracy, or a system of offices and officials that handle the business of government. The head of Egypt's bureaucracy was an official called the vizier. The bureaucracy collected taxes from farmers. Farmers paid these taxes mainly in the form of surplus crops. Remember, we also had a labor tax. We talked about that, a labor tax. In the form of surplus crops, though. The bureaucracy took some of this surplus for itself. It distributed the rest to priests, to the pharaoh, and to artisans and merchants who worked for the pharaoh. Egypt's bureaucracy and system of taxation were a model for later government, including those of today. Flip over to page 148, please. Two great rulers. Here are specific two great rulers to start us off on Pharaoh Week. Egypt's great pharaohs were powerful figures who shaped its history. Hatshepsut, that we read the story about back on page 141, and Ramses II were two famous New Kingdom pharaohs. Hatshepsut. In the story at the beginning of this chapter, you learned about Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule Egypt. She was the daughter of one pharaoh and the wife of another. When her husband died, he left a son who was too young to rule. So Hatshepsut decided to make herself Egypt's new pharaoh. Some Egyptians did not want to bow to a woman. To gain their support, Hatshepsut carried out all the rituals expected of a king. Her statues showed her dressed as a king. She even wore the false beard that was a symbol of the pharaoh's power. Although she was a woman, most Egyptians came to accept her rule. The god's wife Hatshepsut executed the affairs of the two lands according to her counsels. Egypt worked for her, head and bowed. And that came from the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut's rule was peaceful. Hatshepsut built Egypt's wealth and power through trade. She sent traders by sea to a land called Punt in East Africa. They returned with precious wood, ivory, gold, and perfumes. Hatshepsut recorded the story of their journey on the stone walls of an enormous temple that she built. Ramses II. Ramses II, who ruled about 200 years after Hatshepsut, was a different kind of pharaoh. What Hatshepsut had tried to do through trade, Ramses chose to do through war. He spent the first half of his time as pharaoh fighting in Canaan and Syria in the Fertile Crescent. In 1275 BCE, Ramses II led his army against the powerful Hittites. The two armies fought in a place called Kadesh in present-day Syria. In fact, Ramses II lost many soldiers to the Hittites in the Battle of Kadesh. He later made peace with the Hittites by agreeing on a border. Ramses II was a great builder. During his reign, he built more monuments than any other pharaoh. Page 149, Egyptian society. To control Egypt, pharaohs needed the loyalty and labor of the people. Egypt's social order provided both. Egyptian society was shaped like a pyramid. The pharaoh was at the top of the pyramid. Egyptians believed that gods controlled everything. The pharaoh controlled Egypt, so people saw him as a god king who deserved loyalty. Just below the pharaoh were nobles, priests, and officials. They helped the pharaoh govern Egypt. So did scribes, who kept records for its bureaucracy. So far we've talked about the pharaohs, the nobles, priests, and officials, and down here the scribes. Merchants and artisans made up a middle level. In Egypt, painters, stonecutters, and builders spent their entire lives working on temples and tombs. Farmers were lower on the social pyramid. By far, most of the people of ancient Egypt were farmers. During the growing season, farmers raised Egypt's food. For the rest of the year, many were required to work as laborers on the pharaoh's building projects. Most did so willingly out of religious devotion. Devotion meaning a strong feeling of love, loyalty, or commitment. They believed that if they helped the god king, they would be rewarded after death. Slaves were at the bottom of the social pyramid. Many were prisoners of war or debtors who were freed from slavery after serving for a period of time. Slaves were the property of their owners and had to do forced labor. Here's that map.